All right. So the last speaker for this session is Madeleine Ford, University of Otago. So Madeleine was supervised by Dr. Nicola and title of her talk is Soil Microbes and Carbon, Protocols for Measuring Soil Carbon and Microbes. So Madeleine, I'll get you to share your screen, or if not, we can do it through Lincoln.
I was working at Te Herenga Waka under supervision of Nicola Day, and my project was on soil microbes and carbon, and I was evaluating cover crop selection. So a little bit of background. Basically, what I was aiming to do was to conduct a literature review to better understand how cover crops can help to build soil carbon. And I wanted to do this from a biological and cultural perspective. The reason for this is because there's actually quite a lack of understanding around soil carbon processes, and there's been a lot of literature that's come out recently that has kind of put a little bit of the research up in the air, and people are a little bit confused on whether uh, cover crops are or are not helping to build soil carbon. So throughout my project, I conducted a literature review. I did some root staining, looking at some mycorrhiza within some root samples. I also looked at this application that's used to look at soil aggregates, and I did a little bit of field work just on the side. And the aim of the literature review is to have like a future resource to a resource to look back upon to go through to have some future directions for research in this area. So, what are cover crops? Cover crops are plants that are planted in the off season with an agricultural context. And instead of for harvesting, exporting, and selling them, they typically provide a service to the agricultural landscape. The reason you want plants growing in the soil throughout the whole year is that the plants are there, they're photosynthesizing, they're taking carbon from the atmosphere and building it into the ground. And so keeping the soil covered is really important. Um, and cover crops have been promoted for their ability to reduce erosion and improve aggregate stability, as well as improving water infiltration and increase soil carbon to an extent. But that's where there's a little bit of confusion within the research. So how do cover crops contribute to soil carbon sequestration? Basically, the root biomass of the cover crops. It is going into the soil and it's enhancing the soil structure. It's helping aggregates to build, as well as that microbial interactions between the cover crops, the roots, and arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi can enable increased transfer of carbon. And one thing that I found super interesting within my literature review was finding out that microbial necromass, so dead microbial matter, contributes to half of soil organic carbon. So that's a huge, huge amount of the soil organic carbon is coming from microbes. And two-thirds of this comes from fungi. So it's really important to look at how microbes are affecting the soil carbon content. And then as well as that, these plants are once they've kind of grown, they get mulched down back into the soil, and it can lead to the formation of more stable soil compounds, such as humus. And then on the right, you can just see here some examples of some cover crops. There's some oats, which are kind of often used for erosion control, vetch here, which can be used to improve soil nitrogen. And that's just an image of some arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. It forms associations with particular cover crops. And so interesting to see whether some crops can improve soil carbon more or less than others, depending on these interactions with the fungi. So another aspect that I looked into was whether native species could be used in cover cropping in Aotearoa. And so I read this book here, Te Mahi One One Hua Parakore, and it was really awesome. And what it kind of did was looked into soil in terms of the interaction between humans and soil, rather than solely looking at the ecosystem services. And some key questions and thoughts that I had from reading this book, which I've kind of gone through in my literature review, is that we need to evaluate cover crop choice beyond the agricultural benefits, and we need to look at what downstream effects may arise for communities. As well as how mātauranga could be tapped into, built upon, and revived. within using cover cropping in a context to grow food and kai. As well as, yeah, it's really important to reframe soil health to emphasize the well-being benefits to people, rather than just looking at the ecosystem services side of things. And so also while looking into native cover crop species, there was one example in the literature where native species had been investigated. They looked at 14 different species and assessed them for their ecosystem services. And they did have some positive findings. They noticed that there was weeds, the native cover crops suppressed weeds, and they also didn't outcompete the grapevines for water, and they enhanced the soil biological activity. However, they didn't look at whether it specifically built soil carbon, and this was in a viticulture setting, so things could be quite different within an agricultural setting. So that was kind of the broad gist of my project. I really enjoyed working with Nicola Day. Thank you, Bioprotection Aotearoa, for having me, and Victoria University of Wellington for hosting me for the summer. Thank you very much for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Madeleine. So any questions for Madeleine?
Did you look at the kind of compare the kinds of species used for cover crops and whether what determines which species are used? You can imagine that farmers will want species they can plow in quite easily or won't have volunteers in a subsequent crop. And they're probably making decisions more on agronomic grounds than on carbon sequestration grounds. But did you have a look at the kind of species and are there optimal kinds of species that you might want to promote for cover crops in certain cropping systems?
One thing I specifically noticed coming up quite a lot was looking at the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and a higher ratio of carbon to nitrogen seems to be better for improving soil carbon. So I think oats was a species that was particularly mentioned within that sense, but obviously it's not native. But yeah, looking at that ratio of carbon to nitrogen was quite important.
I might expand on that one. So species diversity and carbon sequestration. So advantages over having, say, a single species versus multiple species.
There was a few articles I came across where they'd used like a mixed cover cropping species. So one of them in particular, I think, was oats and peas they'd used together. And not only did it improve soil carbon, but it actually also had a greater effect on the microbial diversity within the soil, which was another thing that was really crucial because so much of that soil carbon is built up due to microbial necromass. So greater diversity and more microbes, more microbial activity in the soil is really important for that. So yeah, definitely mixed cover cropping species made a large difference.
Cool. Excellent. So thank you very much, Madeleine. It's great talk.